Hi there. Welcome to our Christmas Eve, Christmas edition of First Look. Well, we're here. We're at the end of Advent, and I'm excited about that. It's a little chilly in my office, so I decided to go with the vest today. I know you were really wondering about that. And it's exciting. It's a busy week. It's like doing all those little things you got to do. If you're anything like me, then you're doing the Christmas shopping in the last minute, whatever, and trying to figure out the menu and doing all that fun stuff. But then hopefully in there somewhere is, a little bit of Jesus. And so we're going to try to do that part here together. Um, what do you say about the story for this week? Um, you know, we have this amazing kind of opportunity this year to have Christmas Eve on a Saturday and then Christmas Day on a Sunday. And we're doing this joint service with the 319 churches at Wexford. It's at 10:30, by the way, 10:30. Very casual. Carols, readings, it's lessons and carols kind of a vibe, but very casual in terms of dress. And it's one of those times where it's all sort of coming to a head, and you're trying to wrap your mind around the thing that you've been thinking about and praying about for the last few weeks. What does incarnation mean, and what did it mean for the people in that world at that time? And I think this past Sunday, I think we had what I hope is one of those pinnacle moments in thinking through that. And the reason I say that is because what Joseph does is so unique and also speaks so clearly to the person that we would see in Jesus. So last year we talked a lot about ancestors in faith who were women, mothers who, through their strength and endurance and wisdom, um, were pinnacle in creating these moments of incarnation, right? These moments where the world changed. How did Eve and her motherhood change the world? The same for Sarah, the same for Ruth, the same for Mary. And we talked about Mary and the Magnificat, and trying to piece together who Mary was and how the person of Mary influences the person of Jesus. And so I decided to do a little bit of that this year as well. And I think looking at Joseph specifically is important because Joseph, of course, represents the system. He's as the patriarch in a patriarchal society. He represents the system, the rules. And even though he wasn't a rich and influential person, he comes from the David line, and he benefits from that system. And so what we see in the incarnation is Joseph, the father, showing us a little glimpse into who Jesus would be, in the sense that he could have certainly gone the route of punishing, or thinking that Mary should be punished for ending up, with child, and that he was not the father, and what would and there were rules about that, and he decides to go another way. And what does that say about who he is and how he would help to raise Jesus, and how does that influence who Jesus is? And so incarnation, in that sense, challenges a system, and that's a lot of what we're called to do as people of faith, is that we have systems around us that are in need of help and reform and change, and that's a part of how Jesus inspires us. And so that's what we saw in this story. And so we kind of have that in the back of our minds as we read the birth story, because of course all of those same things are still at play. You have Mary, and we've read the Magnificat, and we sort of understand her presence in the world and the way she approaches life. We see that in Joseph, and we think about his story, and that his parents you couldn't help but influence who Jesus is, and how he approaches the world. And so that's a part of what we're going to be looking at here today. So I'm going to get to my passage here. Here we go. So this passage is obviously one that you have read before. It's going to be coupled with a passage from Isaiah. It's also going to be coupled with the reading from John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it speaks to that John passage, of course, speaks to not only the incarnation of Christ, but also the eternal nature of Christ. That's all there and present in the story. So the birth story gives us some context of why this is happening the way that it is, and what was making everything as chaotic as it seemed, and all that. And so we get a little bit of that. But part of what we'll be talking about is the situation that we find Jesus and his family in, and how that kind of changes the way that we see not only the birth story, but how we see Jesus, how we see ourselves. Okay. So here's the story. This is 1 through 20, and I may pause along the way. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, so I don't off the top of my head know what that means, but it gives you a context if you're living at that time. Okay, all went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth into Galilee to Judea, the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. So kind of connecting for us and for the reader, any genealogy that might be available to them, especially if they had the book of Matthew, and connecting the dots between why he would have done that. So he went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged, and who was expecting a child. Now, let's remember that, this story we're putting up against a Matthew story. So this is the Luke reading. Last week was the Matthew reading. There's, there's some layer in there. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, that little place, verse 7, we're going to be talking a lot about that verse, and I don't want to spoil it, but what we're going to be looking at is what did that mean? What inn are we talking about? Where are we going with this story? What did that look like at the time? Why would that have been true, that they couldn't find a place? What did it mean that they couldn't find a place? Without kind of going through each and every step of those, just know that a lot of what we're going to be talking about on Christmas Eve is what was happening. What was happening in that moment? We weren't alive, and we don't understand the subtleties of what's happening. I don't have a good American example for you, but if I told you there wasn't any room at the Holiday Inn, you'd think to yourself, well, surely there are other places you could go. Surely there was, other things like that. And I don't know if making, part of it, part of the scene, as you would imagine, is if everyone's coming into town and everyone is, trying to get registered and do their thing, the way it was being asked of them, could there have just been, it was so crowded, there just wasn't any other place for them to go. And so they found, a place with the animals to have Jesus. And so we want to look at that a little bit. So what you're going to be thinking about this week is, what does that mean about who Mary and Joseph are? How does that inform the way we understand the Jesus story? How does that inform the way that we understand our own story? Because there's certainly some humility to that, and there's a humbleness to that, and and a lack of a sense of place. Now, the other thing you might be thinking about is, well, if if Joseph was going back and taking his family to be registered, why didn't he make any arrangements? Like, why didn't, not call ahead, but why didn't he say to someone? He must have known someone, you would imagine, in his ancestral town. Why were there no arrangements made? And so what does all of that mean? What can we assume about that? So that some of the just context things I'm going to try to work through in the sermon. But I think for our purposes here, because we're kind of wondering and taking a first look at this, we start to try to imagine, what is the most important takeaway from this element. And we're going to look at the rest of the passage in a second, but Jesus born in these very humble settings means something for you and I. And it means something for the ways that we love people. And it's something we have to grapple with. So that's part of what we're going to be talking about. So we'll get back to that in a second. So then the story pivots in verse 8. And it goes from that scene to another scene. In that region there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace among those whom he favors." And when the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in a manger. I'm going to pause right there for a second. I don't know how to take the details of the story, because if the city is super crowded, and that's part of the problem, how on earth did they find Mary and Joseph? I don't know how to answer that question. Did they really just search around? Was it God inspired? How did they find them? And does it matter how they found them? Is that really the point? Because sometimes when we look at the story, sometimes we worry about details that don't actually add to our understanding of the whole. And my goal is to not add details that just kind of keep our brains working, but that they would add something to our understanding of the story. Because at first glance, which is what we're doing here, the only way I can possibly think through how on earth that would happen is two things. One, if you can be visited by a heavenly host and by an angel who can tell you what's about to happen, then God, through God's messenger, can also inspire you to figure out where to go. But it also may tell us something about, did they know who we're talking about? Like, is there some connection between these particular shepherds? And that's, the story never says that. It never says anything like, oh, well, they chose those shepherds because they were related. I mean, it doesn't say that, but I mean, you wonder, like, how could they have possibly figured out where to find those two people? Now, it certainly, I guess, could have gotten around that, hey, there's, a crazy birth story that just happened in the manger. But I don't know. You read the story and you start to kind of wonder. And again, maybe it doesn't matter, because ultimately what I think matters for sure is we go from Joseph and Mary, who first are not in the best of circumstances, don't have it all together, aren't all prepared, don't have it all wrapped up. And I mean, you try to imagine what it must have been like to say, okay, we're going to do this here. And what that means for them, and how we think about the two of them, especially if that was someone in your life. Imagine relaying this story to someone else, right? You're hearing about it, you're Joseph's whoever, and you're being told this story. What would you think of what happened? That's something I've been pondering. But ultimately, we have people who are not in the who don't have every resource in the world. And then we have the shepherds who, in terms of social class, are certainly not at the top. And you have them coming together in this moment, in this humble place, with these humble people who, who from the outside, it's like, Mary's pregnant, having a child. Are you two married? No? Okay. It's like all of that coming together at once, right? And then we move from that image of the two of them, Jesus and the shepherds, to the end of the story. So let me get to the end of the story. When they saw this, they made known what had been told to them about the child, and all who heard it were amazed in what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, and it had been told to them. So they were kind of then the messengers of to the rest of the common people, anyone who would listen to them. And then it goes on to say, it's not in the story, but I'm going to say it just because it was a callback to the sermon for yesterday. After 8 days had passed, it was time for to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. Okay. So the sermon is called "Are You In or Out?" In being spelled I-N-N, the intentional play on words. And part of the point that I want to make ultimately is this situation, how this birth story, what it says about all of it. And I think that one of the things that we can't overlook is who these people were and who they are in comparison to you and to me. So we spend a whole lot of time, I think, in church trying to be who we think we're supposed to be. And then that is usually combats with who we actually are. And most people, at least in this church, would not find themselves in a place where they or anyone in their family would have to have their child born in a less than ideal situation. The people in this church and I have the not only the financial resources, but the connection, the communal and family resources to, if nothing else, be born in a safe, dry, warm place. And so the idea of this happening, I think, for at least anyone here, seems kind of foreign and kind of outside of the experience, which I think is the hardest part for me, if I'm honest with you. I think one of the things that we talk about so often is the relatability of who Jesus is. And that's one of the things I talked about during the Advent Adventure thing on one of the first Wednesdays, was that we talked about who we know Jesus to be and why Jesus is so important, why the incarnation is so important to us. And what all of you said who were in the room was something that was relatable, even though nothing about Jesus' story is relatable. He's a carpenter's son whose all of his references are either landowning and tenant farming and shepherding. All of his world is a world that the people in this church and many people across America at least can't really relate to. And yet what we say is that we relate to Jesus, even though his life, what he looked like, the language that he spoke, the time period in which he existed, everything about Jesus is not relatable to us. And yet we talk about the relatability as the most important thing. And I think what we discovered is that, well, it's not his life or what he looked like or all those things that don't matter. They don't matter as much, right? We know in our heads, even if the pictures on our walls or in our sanctuaries or in our grandmother's home were of a Jesus that had dark hair and our colored skin and a beard, we know that that's not what Jesus looked like in our heads. But we yearn for something that feels relatable. And this story, frankly, just isn't relatable, at least not to you and I. And sometimes I think about the fact that maybe it's not supposed to be. But what is relatable is this. The birth of Jesus, the person of Jesus, has to get us to a place where we are thinking about the people, not only that Jesus was there to serve, but who he actually was. And he was someone who didn't have every financial advantage in the world. But what he did have are two parents who were extremely amazing examples of compassionate thinking, not just for their own time, but for that time. What his parents gave him was not every security or every advantage or whatever in the world. That's not what happened for Jesus. And if you were going to give that to anyone, you'd think it's the Messiah. Because the reality of his life is born to parents who are in the midst of scandal and yet are also advocates through word and deed for a radical kind of justice in the world. We see that in the actions of Joseph. We see that in the Magnificat of Mary. That's the way that they're portrayed. That's the way they're portrayed from the beginning. And they have to run off and escape in Egypt and be refugees in Egypt, and death follows him everywhere he goes, and he has this life that doesn't look like ours, but what we relate to is what he is, the family that he has around him that inspires him to be someone who then goes out into the world to share a kind of extreme and inclusive love that reflects the world that he existed in. He doesn't use his upbringing as some sort of hindrance. All of that informs him about what is important. And you and I do, at best, probably a mediocre job of getting at any of that. And one of the things that I think is amazing about this story is who Jesus, who Mary and Joseph, who the authors of the Gospels are telling us who is in and who is out. And this story should inspire us to really get our heads around that. Because who are we in that story, right? We're not there in the manger. We're the people that already have a room, right? I mean, fundamentally. So this story, as you're thinking about it this week, should really give you a sense of, if you were living those experiences, right? Because there had to have been a lot of other families and a lot of other kids and a lot of other people who were in the situation that Jesus and Mary and Joseph were in, right? Who didn't come from ideal settings, who didn't do everything the right way, who didn't have all the resources in the world, and yet this is the focus for Jesus. And what does that mean? And not only just for them, but really for you and I, about how we understand our role in the world and who we are. Because you and I aren't in the manger. And we would probably like to think that we would have had made more substantive plans than Joseph. And if he didn't, then why? Like, those are the questions that we have. So that's what I wanted to that's a lot of questions, that's a lot of wondering and pondering, but that's what I wanted to do for you this week, is give you a lot of questions to start to ponder and go from there. So my time with you has run out. So thank you for doing this with me. Thanks for being a part of everything. Again, Christmas Eve will be at 3 p.m. at Northmont, and then Christmas Day will be at Wexford at 10:30 a.m. So until then, thank you for being who you are. Merry Christmas if I don't see you before, and I'll be joining you next week for another First Look. Take care.